Welcome to Hub-Bub, the People's Podcast, where we engage our citizens and investors with the activities of the Planning and Code Administration and encourage everyone to contribute to Hagerstown's growth.
Well, welcome to the September edition of the Hub-Bub Podcast. My name is Sean Brown. I'm here with the more popular Donnie Harcum. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well today. How are you?
Doing great.
You give me too much credit, that's for sure.
I didn't originate that. It comes from others around.
From the social media lands?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I can't take for credit. I'm just passing along what I hear.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Well, this month's podcast is really a good one. I think it's important to us, especially with both of us being parents.
Yes.
What was your take when you found out we were going to do this podcast?
I was excited to spread the word and to make sure that people were aware of different protections that we could use to protect our children. So, as a father myself of a 11-month-old, this is a lot of stuff that I researched early on, and some stuff that I didn't know about. So I think it's very important for everybody to be aware of.
Yeah, you make a good point, Donnie, because if we don't know, we don't know. And so I think our podcast today will perhaps reveal some things that many people don't know as it relates to code, which is what we do. A lot of what we do is related to protection of everybody, safety, but especially children.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of codes in place that, yes, it does protect everybody, but some of these codes were put in place due to, with children in mind, for example. So.
Yeah. So it's not a coincidence that this month is Baby Safety Month, the month of September. A lot of helpful tips if you go on the web and just look at a number of resources related to this particular month. A lot of good tips. There was a program started back in 1983. We might add that in November is also going to be National Child Safety and Protection Month. So with those two combined, that's really the basis for our podcast today. But, kind of like what we've talked about in the past is the fact is that when it comes to safety, oftentimes, unfortunately, it's the last thing that people think about.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It should be, foremost in our minds, but unfortunately, that's not always the case.
Yeah. And not necessarily always intentional, but a lot of times when we're thinking about safety, it can be an added cost.
Yes.
It adds time and expense, and so that may not be a priority. But our podcast today is going to highlight the fact that even though there may be those things, additional costs and time and consideration that we may not want to take into consideration, it really is highly important. So as always, we're going to talk about a number of things as it relates to codes, some specific, some broad, some that are related to the city of Hagerstown. But it's always important to check with your local jurisdiction to see what your specific code requirements are. But as we'll talk about today, there are a number of things that really come into protecting our children within our community that we as a local jurisdiction, as every local jurisdiction, has in mind. And one of those things is when we've talked about in previous episodes. In fact, episode 3 was our podcast on zoning, how land is used, how it's developed. And some of the land use regulations play an important role as it relates to child safety. When we're talking about the environment and certain types of businesses. So what we'll find is that generally speaking, zoning is also taking into consideration protecting people, protecting children as it relates to some businesses. So as we know, just speaking in general, there are some businesses that we don't want in close vicinity or proximity of children.
Absolutely. And you with the zoning background, you are very knowledgeable in this kind of stuff. But whenever I came to start this job, I didn't, like we mentioned in the zoning episode before, I didn't realize why businesses were located where they were. There are certain restrictions as you're going to touch on in a minute. So.
Yeah, so one example of that is adult bookstores. Now, the law and case history says that, hey, these are allowed, you have to permit them in certain communities. But we can also regulate where they are, right? So the zoning does allow to do that. So there are zoning laws that prohibit adult bookstores being in proximity of schools, churches, hospitals, nursing homes, even neighborhood. And again, there's Supreme Court cases regarding this and the authority. And localities are able to use zoning as a way to restrict where certain businesses can be located. And this goes back to the early or late 70s, rather. So, for example, there was a Supreme Court case in the city of Detroit where they were allowed to prohibit adult theaters from concentrating in one area of the city. It was argued that this was a violation of freedom of speech, but it wasn't that the Supreme Court was prohibiting speech at all, but it was restricting what could be viewed and where. And the Supreme Court case, one of the cases that were considered to be one of the most important with land use attorneys, was in 1986, the city of Renton versus Playtime Theater Incorporated. And in that decision, the court upheld a city ordinance prohibiting adult motion picture theaters from locations within 1,000 feet of any residential area, church, park, or school. And so the court noted that law addressed valid government responses to problems which such businesses can bring to communities. And there was another important point made in this court case, that legislators, what they didn't have to do was each time this happened in a locality, they didn't have to readdress this every time. But what they could do is basically a precedent was established with already communities that already addressed it. And so what the local government authorities could do is they could rely on that information that had already been established in other communities as a basis for doing the same thing in their own. So in other words, it kept that process from being kept repeated over and over. So again, these types of zoning laws prohibit these types of uses being within usually so many feet of other uses. Feet. I mean, I got two, but anyway. So here in Hagerstown, it's very, very similar. Here in Hagerstown, we prohibit the type of uses such as adult bookstores and the like to be within 1,000 feet of a school, church, hospital, nursing home, or park. And this is a very, very common practice. Even our larger city to the east of us in Baltimore, they've had these type of regulations in place since the early 1990s. And we've, of course, related to zoning, as we've already talked about, what zoning basically does is it says that these types of uses can be in these areas, and these areas, and these areas. And that's for a number of reasons, but one of the layers is that protection for children. So, as an example, in the city of Hagerstown, uses such as a school or a child care facility cannot be constructed in an industrial zone district. And if we just think about the reasons why that makes sense.
Right. That does make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of interesting information. It's one of those things, too, once you're aware of those regulations, you start thinking about it. When you're out driving around, you see, an industrial zone, like you said, or a location that we mentioned, and you start thinking, how close is that to a school or a church, or a child care facility? And you realize, it is, beyond 1,000 feet, or feet, as in Sean's case. But yeah, there's a lot of good information. And something else you may not be aware about is, sidewalk and landscaping requirements. Those are put in place as well to keep children and adults like us safe when they're walking to school or a place of business. So to focus on sidewalks first, this is to motivate children to walk or ride a bike to and from school with proper sidewalk design, that goes hand in hand. So the access route should provide an efficient and safe walk to school that will give the students enough space to travel, separated from motor vehicles and other road traffic. So the point is we want to keep them far away from the vehicle traffic as possible. When designing the sidewalk, parents with strollers and toddlers, the elderly, pregnant women, and people with mobility constraints in wheelchairs are always kept in mind. Other factors include adequate road crossings, night lighting, street signs, and that's to indicate that there's pedestrian or a pedestrian route so that motorists are aware. A question could be asked, why do we care about children walking to school? Well, there are approximately 31% of children in grades kindergarten through 8 who lived 1 mile from school that walk or bike to and from school. It's an interesting statistic. I didn't realize there was that many kids that walk or ride bike to school. And that is a significant decrease from previous decades. In 1972, that showed 89% of students were walking or biking to school. Did you walk or bike to school, Sean?
Yes, I lived about 2 miles from school.
Oh, okay.
And my mom worked single parent,
Okay.
so I had no choice.
Right.
Walked, and then I got a bicycle, and fortunately there were a lot of sidewalks. So
That is good. You weren't weaving in and out of traffic. I'm happy to hear that. And although that number has decreased, the Safe Routes to School program is leading the way in addressing the needs for proper sidewalks. This is, if we save one life due to proper design, I think that's worth it in the end.
absolutely.
And something else is landscaping. During a site plan review process, the type of vegetation being installed in the islands or around the property, that's identified on those plans. For example, there may be toxic plants that are banned in certain areas, and these species are reviewed to ensure that they meet locally adopted codes and do not create hazards for those that are walking around the sidewalk or just pedestrians in general. So.
Yeah, it's just interesting how so many things are taken into consideration with safety in mind, especially with our children. And that includes even structures, the homes we live in. And we've talked about that in the past with regulations that are in place to protect children and structures. Those are highly important, and there are a number of them. And kind of as you alluded to in the very beginning, what unfortunately happens is we may not recognize a need for something safety related until something catastrophic happens.
Right.
But that's the way it always has happened.
These rules come from somewhere. Unfortunately, the safety issues, they do come from an incident that has happened in the past.
Yeah. So that's for one reason, that's why codes are constantly updated and changed. Basically, it's every 3 years. Codes are looked at. Hey, what's changed in the past few years? Do they need to update to address the issues? And so that's part of the development of the code that goes into place. And in fact, if you watch our the first episode of the Hub-Bub Podcast, we really go into a lot of detail about how this process works. But, basically anyone can bring up a concern. Anyone can say, hey, this is a problem. Maybe you notice a trend in accidents in this area, and maybe a code doesn't address it. Anybody can bring this up to the code organization, such as ICC. So what will happen is the code amendment organization, they'll bring it up, they'll talk about it. Is there a change needed? So it's proposed, and then the committee can review it and even adopt it if they see a trend where something needs to be put in place. So it's just constantly evolving as times and technology change. New things present themselves and they have to be addressed.
Absolutely. That's some good information. And one thing that we want to bring up is how some of these codes have been put in place to protect our children. So for example, guardrail spacing. The pickets or balusters cannot be larger than 4 inches when we're talking about guardrails. And the reason behind the 4-inch rule is it's to prevent a 4-inch sphere from passing between the pickets. That's less than the average size of a child's head is where the 4-inch sphere comes from. That code has evolved over the years to address the safety of guardrails. In 1975, BOCA, they stated horizontal rails were not to be over 10 inches apart or balusters not over 6 inches apart. In the 1978 BOCA, they changed it to 6 inches for both of them. The 6-inch sphere was first mentioned in the 1984 BOCA and was reduced to 4 inches in the 1990 BOCA. Which the 4-inch requirement has become the standard since. So you can see, it started at 10 inches. I can't imagine having a 10-inch opening in guardrails these days. But as we mentioned, kids have probably gotten hurt, or even adults have gotten hurt with that big of an opening, and now has been reduced to a 4-inch requirement. It's highly recommended that guardrails are brought to current code if children are residing in a structure. If that gap is larger than 4 inches, it's very important if you do have kids in your residence to bring that up to code. And just in general, guardrails are to be constructed within 34 inches to 42 inches in height above the floor when the surface is elevated 30 inches or more above the grade. Locally, we permit existing guardrail heights down to the height of 30 inches. So please always check with your local jurisdiction on the height requirements for guardrails. Guardrails are to be secured to resist pressure. The strength along the top of the guardrail is to resist 200 pounds of pressure in any direction. So for little kids, that really should be plenty of protection, but just guardrails in general for adults, that it needs to be able to hold back 200 pounds of pressure in any direction. Some additional tips for children relating to guardrails. Don't place any furniture, boxes, or other items next to the guardrail. Children love to climb. I'm learning that myself with my 11-month-old. It's just natural to him to walk up to something and raise his leg like he's going to climb. He hasn't started yet, but I know it's coming, and that scares me. So just keep those obstacles away to prevent children from climbing to get into more danger than they should be. So.
Yeah. I mean, how many children have we seen go up to, railings and stick their head, and they try to stick their head
right
through, and you're watching them.
Yep.
So they're going to do it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, excellent. So again, just a number of things to testify that just things that we may not normally think about, and that includes even the receptacles that we have in our home. That's another area that really, really is important as we're going to talk about. And so we've seen that technology come a long way.
Absolutely.
In the recent past with electrical receptacles, to the point where now we have what are called tamper-resistant electrical receptacles. We have a couple right here. And so if you haven't heard of these tamper-resistant receptacles, basically what they are is they're a receptacle. They look kind of the same until you look up close, and you're going to see inside those holes some little shutters. They're spring-loaded, and they're not easily opened. You have to actually have a little bit of force. You'll notice as soon as you try to plug something in, because you're going to have to push past those little shutters to get into the contact opening and through those slots. And so what that does is it basically keeps a child from just easily inserting something in and shocking themselves. Now the interesting thing about these receptacles with these tamper-resistant is that they have to both be compressed at the same time.
Okay, so not one end it would allow. So both of them have to go in at the same time.
Exactly. So that keeps that child from taking a wire, as they will do, and normally just sticking one in. It's not going to open at all.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they're really an important step to make the home a safer place for children. So
I do have a question for you. If I don't have children in my home, are tamper-resistant receptacles still required?
Yeah, that's a good question. So here's what you have to think about. Even if you don't have children at home, what are scenarios are likely even if you don't have children presently?
Sure.
You sell your home. A family moves in. Of course, we don't have many visitors these days with the pandemic, but you have family over, and they have children. I mean, how bad would you feel
right.
if a grandchild, a niece or a nephew got a hold of one of these? So it's really just good common sense, and that's why these requirements are across the board, these code requirements. It's not going to ask the question, do you have children? But really this code requirement ensures all new homes with new construction, new homes and apartments, be safe for children to have these tamper, because nothing is permanent. The situation is not permanent. So why require tamper-resistant electrical receptacles? Well, you may not think, I don't hear much about electrical shock from the receptacles, do we? Or do you?
Not so much. Not a whole lot, personally.
Yeah, I mean, I never did it, but my brother, I don't know what he had, some kind of fetish, but twice in our home, he stuck stuff in the receptacle. Gosh. And we just saw an arc. He was we just didn't see him. But anyway, it does happen. And that is just one of those things that just because we don't hear much about it doesn't mean it doesn't happen a lot. Not absolutely everything is reported in the news, as we know. But here's some interesting statistics. Each year, approximately 2,400 children suffer severe shock and burns when they stick items into the slots of electrical receptacles.
Wow.
2,400 a year. But on top of that, it is estimated that there are 6 to 12 child fatalities a year related to this.
Wow. It doesn't sound like a lot, but even just one is too many, especially when it can be prevented.
That's what I was thinking. Even just one, if that was your one, that would be one too many.
Devastating,
Yeah. So we're talking about something that, yes, it's an additional cost as well. These tamper-resistant electrical receptacles, they're about 50 cents more than an unprotected receptacle. So if you take the average home, which maybe have 75 receptacles, that cost is just under $50 more to add something that could save a life.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So some would argue, well, I put the safety caps in the outlets. But in all honesty, is that really something that is going to completely fix the problem? How many of us have taken one out to plug something in and then forget to put it back on?
Just left it open. Yep.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So they can be lost. You leave it on the ground. Now you've created another risk because the child comes along and they're not concerned about the outlet. They see this cover on the floor and they put it in their mouth, and that's a choking hazard.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So really, it's really just a very inexpensive, not much trouble, easy solution to save many, many lives. And so children, they can really be saved by seeing their parents' good example, by providing these safe measures. And these tamper-resistant receptacles, they provide security against the children inserting objects other than cord or plugs into these energized parts. And so these tamper-resistant electrical receptacles, they've been required for a while. In fact, they were first required in the 2008 National Electrical Code. And so these types of receptacles, they've been required for the protection because they've seen, hey, yes, we've seen too many deaths, too many accidents. We need to put something in place to protect children.
Great. That's some good information. And to go along with the tamper-resistant, I know we mentioned it in previous podcasts as well, is the ground fault circuit interrupter receptacles, or GFCIs. That's probably what you normally hear them as. And what the GFCI is, it shuts off electric power when it detects a current is flowing along an unattended path, such as through water or a person. It's used to reduce the risk of electric shock, which can cause the heart to stop or cause burns. They can also prevent some fires, like when a live wire touches a metal conduit. GFCIs have been in the home for decades. Although they have been the standard, locations have been added over the years to add more levels of protection. GFCIs were first required by swimming pools in 1971. They were not required until 1975 in bathrooms. Now GFCIs are required in bathrooms, garages, kitchens, unfinished basements, crawl spaces, and laundry areas inside the home. And as we have here, this one here is an arc fault circuit interrupter that also has the tamper resistance that Sean was just talking about. The next thing we want to talk about is anti-scald protection. So this is one of those topics, as I mentioned, I didn't know much about coming into the podcast, but a lot of good information here. You may not be aware that hot water is in your plumbing system, and it may cause serious physical injuries to your kid or yourself. Even adults can fall prey to hot water burns, but the elderly and small children are particularly vulnerable. Imagine the potential for injury if you are not paying proper attention and walked into your shower to scalding water. Fortunately, there is a possibility to protect yourself against these types of burns. There's anti-scald protection valves, which you can see here. This guy right here, they detect water from reaching an unsafe temperature, and it stops the water flow automatically. As the water temperature cools, the water flow is restored through that valve. The main advantage to installing a protection valve is that all the fixtures in your home are protected by using the valve. You can still go and do a single fixture, say you go to your bathroom, your shower head, you replace that with anti-scald protection. That's great, but it's only protecting that specific feature, whereas the anti-scald protection valve protects your entire house. It's very unusual to know the precise temperature of water coming out of your faucet or shower. In many cases, knowing if the water is too hot is based on personal preferences. So how do you know if your home needs anti-scald protection? Unless your skin is extremely sensitive, the average acceptable temperature for water is approximately 118 degrees. Raising this temperature by just 2 degrees will make it uncomfortable for many people. While washing your hands under this temperature of water is not likely caused a burn, but if you left it under a stream for 7 to 8 minutes, it would cause a first-degree burn. And remember that the higher the temperature of water, the shorter the time needed for a burn. For example, it just takes 28 seconds under 130-degree water to burn, but this is reduced to only 3 seconds if the temperature is increased to 140 degrees. If you want to avoid becoming one of these statistics where 34 people are fatally injured and estimated that 5,000 children are scalded in the bathtub each year from hot water, you can install the anti-scald valve. These valves are relatively simple to install and can be placed into an existing home without the need to tear out any walls. Be sure to contact your local licensed plumber on the cost of installing this valve. And they've been around since the mid-1990s, so it's interesting to know that is an available option to people. So to go along with hot water, I did bring in this bad boy from home. So looks like your standard rubber ducky, right? My standard rubber ducky. You don't have one. Oh, you're missing out. But so this here, once the water is above 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the bottom has the word hot on it. It will turn white. So you can kind of see it right now, but it really stands out under hot temperature. To be honest, I didn't know that was on the bottom of the rubber duck until we started preparing for this episode. I'm like, wait, I think I read that about the rubber duck that we had. A lot of us, we can touch the water, we know the temperature, but everybody's skin is different, and to have something like that, to know companies are putting our children's safety as a priority, just a simple rubber duck, it's pretty amazing and good to know.
Yeah, absolutely. That, and to that point too, sometimes what we forget is that a child's skin is much more sensitive than someone who's weathered their skin for years.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah. So, good things. You can't always just use your own judgment on yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah. Excellent. Now, another area that is really, really important as it comes to the safety of children, the family in general, is the smoke alarms. And we've covered this topic back in episode 2 of the podcast, where we really delved into the evolution of smoke alarms and just general requirements for smoke alarms. If you haven't listened to that, take a listen to that, because a lot of good information and really requirements that one should know when it comes to smoke alarms. But although what we're going to talk about here for a moment is not a code requirement, there's something very interesting that's been revealed in some studies as it relates to smoke alarms, and that is that now what we used to have just an audible sound smoke alarm, which we're all very, very familiar with, now there are talking smoke alarms.
Yes.
Interesting.
It is.
I didn't know that before. But so there were some research teams from the National Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, and Ohio State University, and what they did is they compared the effectiveness of 3 maternal voice smoke alarms versus the conventional high-pitched tone alarms in waking children. And the results were very interesting. They showed that a maternal voice alarm was 3 times more likely to wake a child than a tone alarm.
Wow.
I mean, it kind of makes sense, But anyway, but also 85% of the children woken by a maternal voice alarm had enough time to escape, compared to just 51% of the tone alarm.
Wow.
That's pretty significant, isn't it?
That's a high number.
Yeah. So the takeaway from the studies were that most of the children who awoke within 5 minutes of the voice alarm were able to perform the escape procedure within the 5 minutes. And it showed that maternal voice alarm use may be able to reduce fire injuries and fatalities among children old enough to perform self-rescue.
And we're talking 5 minutes, any second counts in that instance.
Isn't that true? Now, it's still going on study. There's still some questions that remain. In other words, more research is needed to look at whether another female or male voice can be equally effective compared to a mother's voice. And with the advancement in technology, we may be able to even use an app. I mean, we use apps for everything now.
Right. Yeah, and there's actually, smart smoke alarms out there currently. Back in the early 2000s, there was a company who made a voice recorder smoke alarm. So you could record your voice, so hopefully your child would recognize that over just your standard alarm noise or another type of voice. I think it was ahead of its time in the early 2000s, but now with the new smart smoke alarms, I do think we will probably see some of those in the near future. So that was a lot of good information, and I think as I mentioned, or as we both mentioned in episode 2, this is one of the most looked for items and top priority items when we're doing inspections, just because it does matter that much.
Yeah.
So we're going to shift gears a little bit and go into lead paint laws. So here in Maryland, the lead law has been in place since October 1st, 1994. Maryland's reduction of lead risk in housing law requires owners of rental properties built before 1978 to register their units with the Maryland Department of the Environment. They distribute specific educational materials and meet specific lead paint risk reduction standards at certain triggering events. Check with your local jurisdiction on what lead paint laws may be required in your state.
Very good. Good. And that's really important. Time doesn't allow us to delve into the whole lead paint law, but and then there's a lot of opinions when it comes to lead paint, but the bottom line is that it is a safety factor we want to take into consideration with our children. So, yeah. So, today we've talked about a number of regulations that are in place. They're things that says, hey, you need to do these. And of course, we should want to do them.
Right.
Not because somebody tells us to.
Exactly.
But the laws have to be in place to enforce that as well. But there are a lot of things that we're not necessarily required to do, but are really smart.
Just good tips, say.
Absolutely. So maybe we'd like to share just some top general tips from the Safe Kids Worldwide organization that are just some really just common sense tips that we can do to keep children safe in our home. And there are 5 of them. First, give young children your full and undivided attention when they are in the bathtub or around water. You may think you're just going to leave for a second, and it only takes a second.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Number 2, check smoke alarms monthly. Anything can happen. It's good to check to make sure they're working. Number 3, keep cribs clear of objects, and make sure babies sleep alone on their backs and in a crib every time they sleep. It's for the safety of the baby in a number of ways. Number 4, install safety gates to keep children from falling down staircases, and window guards or stops to prevent falls from windows. Some people will think that, well, there's a screen there. Doesn't necessarily take a lot of force to push through a screen. A child could simply just lose its balance and fall, and it can go through the screen. So don't look at screens as that barrier. And then lastly, keep all medicine up and away, even medicine you take every day. I thought about this as it relates to, especially kind of like we were talking about again in the beginning, not every scenario is the same. So say, for example, we don't have children, not me personally, but in general, but you have over a niece and nephew. Maybe you're one that takes medicine. Well, you may keep normally your pills and things out in easy reach because they're convenient for you and you don't have to worry about that. But you have children over, that's definitely a factor. So be alert to medicine stored in other locations like pills and purses, vitamins on the counter, medicine, on nightstands. Make sure they're out of reach.
Great. That's a lot of good tips, Sean, and I appreciate that. I think what we can both agree on at the end of this episode is, just put your kids first. They rely on you for their safety. They don't always know what's safe and what's not. So, taking the stand and being there for the children, I think that's what we have to do as their parents. So.
Yeah, if we're a parent, the last thing we want to say is what we hear is when an accident happens, either they said, well, I didn't know, or it only took a second, or I would have done this differently. That's a regret that a parent has to live with, and they never thought it would happen. Well, what we've talked about today are very easy things, not a burden, but easy steps to prevent someone from having that regret.
Right. And you brought up a couple times how it, could cost a little bit of money and time. It's one of those things sometimes that we keep pushing off. I'll get to it. You don't want to get to it when it's too late. All right. Well, that about wraps it up for the September's episode of the Hub-Bub Podcast. I know we covered a lot of information in there, but thankfully we're only one click away. If you'd like to go back and listen to any of the referenced podcasts that we mentioned, you can go to YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or most any other podcast platforms that you use. All you have to do is search for the Hub-Bub Podcast. You can also catch up with us on Facebook and Instagram by searching for the Hub-Bub Podcast. And by following us on our social media, you'll be able to find recaps of the previous episodes. We'll throw a dad joke in there once in a while, and teasers for future episodes. And speaking of teasers, for next month's episode, we're going to dive into the world of CPTED. Now, what's CPTED? It's an acronym for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. So that's essentially a way to approach crime prevention by using urban and architectural design. It's a really interesting topic that most people have never given any thought to. Similar to the zoning restrictions and regulations, there's a reason certain things are the way they are that you may not have thought. It may look pretty, but there's also more reasons to it.
Yeah, so if you're a developer, someone who's involved in new construction, or even if you're a landlord, we would encourage you to pay particular attention to the next month's episode, because it's going to help you in those roles that you have. It's going to make life easier on you. So listen. Absolutely.
All right, so time for our weird news story of the week, or the month. I'm not going to read the title quite yet. All right, so in Minneapolis, police received a call about someone stuck in a baby swing. So a caller said that their friend was stuck in a swing. Fortunately, the fire department was able to get the lady out, but anyone who was listening to the scanner probably got a kick out of it when someone said that an adult was stuck in the baby swing. What's even crazier after reading this article is about how often this happens. Usually it comes from a dare amongst friends, but as the article states, I think it pertains to a lot of things in life. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So next time you're at the playground, think twice before daring your friend or even yourself of getting in that baby swing. So
yeah, don't be that guy.
Don't be that guy. It's embarrassing for everybody.
Yeah, and I guess, I don't know if it said it in that article, but usually when I see stuff like that, I'm thinking, yeah, alcohol was involved.
You're probably right.
Yeah, but anyway, yeah, good story. All right, so to round out our episode today, we have our musical guest in the form of a group today, Hagerstown-based rock band called the South Mountain Breed. And they're a nice cover band, really nice sound. They got a really nice range to them. Four-piece band consisting of Jack Jenkins, Tony McLean, Butch Moser, and Pat Henson. And it's obvious they really like and enjoy their music and got a nice history in music. They play a variety of classic rock from the 80s and 90s, throw some country in there. So they play a lot, not as much now with COVID going on, but they're still playing some events, including So upcoming events, they're going to be playing at Foster's on the Point September 20. They're kind of somewhat of a regular there.
Okay.
But they play a lot of different places, and they're going to be playing at the Interstate Barbecue Festival.
Nice.
On October 3rd. So check them out. They're on social media as well. They've got a Facebook page. They're on YouTube as well. You can check some of the music. It's called the South Mountain Breed. So again, as always, we'll listen to their music.